The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast sea of sand and rock that shimmered under the brutal afternoon sun. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the forward operating base, her hand shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon. The wind carried fine grains of sand that stung exposed skin, and the temperature hovered somewhere around 115 degrees. She had been in this God-forsaken place for 8 months now, leading reconnaissance missions and coordinating airstrikes against enemy positions. But today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made her instincts scream that something big was about to happen. Sarah was 32 years old, a decorated pilot who had worked her way up through the ranks with determination and skill that left her male counterparts both impressed and intimidated. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, with dark hair usually pulled back in a tight bun, sharp green eyes that missed nothing, and a jaw set with the kind of determination that came from proving herself in a world that still sometimes questioned whether women belonged in combat roles. She had flown over 200 combat missions, earned 3 air medals, and had a reputation for ice-cold composure under fire. Her call sign was Valkyrie, given to her after a particularly harrowing mission where she had single-handedly provided air support that saved an entire platoon from being overrun. The briefing room was stifling hot despite the air conditioning unit that rattled and wheezed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the desert heat. Sarah entered to find her squadron already assembled, along with several intelligence officers she didn't recognize. The room fell silent as Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, strode to the front. He was a tall man with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of too many years in too many war zones. He moved with the deliberate precision of a career military officer, and his eyes held the weight of countless difficult decisions. Colonel Harrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. He activated the projector, and satellite imagery flooded the screen behind him. The image showed a long stretch of desert highway, and even from the aerial view, Sarah could see the unmistakable signature of a massive convoy. Dozens of vehicles stretched along the road like beads on a string, their shadows sharp and distinct in the overhead sun. Trucks, armored personnel carriers, fuel tankers, and what looked like mobile command units created a formation that spoke of military precision and significant resources. The intelligence officer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Captain David, stepped forward to provide the details. His voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of urgency that immediately caught Sarah's attention. According to their intelligence, this convoy belonged to a regional militia group that had been causing havoc for months. They had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, civilian populations, and infrastructure. The convoy was transporting weapons, ammunition, and supplies to several forward positions where the militia was planning a major offensive. If that offensive succeeded, it could destabilize the entire region and cost countless lives. What made this convoy particularly significant was its composition and destination. Intelligence suggested it contained not just standard military equipment, but advanced weaponry that had been smuggled in from hostile nations. There were reports of anti-aircraft systems, heavy artillery, and possibly even chemical weapons components. The convoy was also carrying command and control equipment that would allow the militia to coordinate attacks across a much wider area than they currently could. Destroying this convoy wouldn't just be a tactical victory. It would be a strategic blow that could cripple the militia's operational capabilities for months. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. Colonel Harrison's expression grew darker as he explained the situation. The convoy was traveling through an area where the rules of engagement were extremely restrictive. There were civilian populations nearby, and the political situation was delicate. Higher command, sitting safely in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away, had deemed the convoy untouchable until further notice. The risk of collateral damage, they said, was too high. The potential for international backlash was too great. They needed more time to assess, to coordinate with allies, to ensure every possible precaution was taken. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she listened. She had heard this song before, the bureaucratic dance of caution and hesitation that often came from people who weren't on the ground, who didn't understand that wars weren't won by endless deliberation. She glanced at the other pilots in the room and saw her frustration reflected in their faces. They all knew what untouchable meant in practical terms. It meant watching a legitimate military target slip away because someone was afraid of making a difficult decision. It meant giving the enemy time to disperse, to reach their destination, to use those weapons against coalition forces and innocent civilians. The briefing continued with technical details about the convoy's composition, its route, and its estimated timeline. Intelligence had been tracking it for 3 days as it moved through the desert, using a combination of satellite imagery, drone surveillance, and human intelligence from local sources. The convoy was disciplined and well-organized, moving only during certain hours and taking precautions against air attack. They traveled in a spread formation that made them harder to hit all at once, and they had anti-aircraft capabilities that would make any attack run dangerous. Captain pulled up additional imagery showing the surrounding terrain. The convoy was moving through a relatively isolated stretch of highway that cut through open desert. The nearest village was 8 miles to the east, well outside any reasonable blast radius. The road itself ran through a natural valley between 2 ridges of rocky hills, which would actually help contain any explosions and limit the spread of debris. From a tactical standpoint, it was actually an ideal location for an airstrike. The convoy would be channeled by the terrain, making it harder for them to disperse, and the isolation meant minimal risk to civilians. Sarah studied the imagery with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted hundreds of target assessments. She could see the shadows cast by the vehicles, estimate their speed from the spacing between them, and identify the likely positions of command vehicles and high-value targets. Her mind was already running through attack profiles, calculating approach angles, weapons loads, and escape routes. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at, and every instinct she had was screaming that this was a legitimate, important target that needed to be engaged immediately. But the word from command was clear and non-negotiable. The convoy was untouchable. They were to maintain surveillance only, track its progress, and report back. No offensive action was authorized. Any pilot who violated those orders would face court-martial, career destruction, and possibly criminal charges. Colonel Harrison made it crystal clear that he was passing along orders he didn't necessarily agree with, but they were orders nonetheless, and they would be followed. The briefing broke up, and Sarah found herself walking back across the base with her wingman, Lieutenant. Was a solid pilot, younger than Sarah by 5 years, with the kind of easy confidence that came from natural talent. He had been flying with her for 6 months, and they had developed the kind of trust that was essential in combat aviation. He knew what she was thinking before she spoke, and right now, his expression told her he was just as frustrated as she was. They didn't discuss it openly, not in the open where anyone could hear, but the look they exchanged said everything. This was wrong, and they both knew it. That convoy represented a clear and present danger to coalition forces and to the civilians in the region who were trying to live their lives under constant threat from the militia. Letting it reach its destination would cost lives, probably many lives, and for what? To avoid making someone in a distant office uncomfortable. To prevent some political embarrassment. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon in her quarters, a small metal shipping container that had been converted into living space. It was sparse, just a cot, a small desk, a few personal items, and a picture of her family back home. She looked at that picture often, especially before missions. Her parents, both retired teachers, who had always supported her dreams even when those dreams led her into danger. Her younger brother, who had followed her into the military and was currently serving on a ship somewhere in the Pacific. They were her anchor, her reminder of why she did this job. As evening fell, Sarah made her way to the operations center where they maintained constant surveillance on the convoy. The room was dimly lit, illuminated primarily by the glow of computer screens and monitors showing various feeds from drones and satellites. A handful of analysts sat at workstations, monitoring the convoy's progress and updating its position on digital maps. The atmosphere was professional but underlaid with frustration. Everyone in this room understood the significance of what they were watching, and everyone knew they were being ordered to let it slip through their fingers. The senior analyst on duty, a sergeant named Williams who had been doing intelligence work for 15 years, brought Sarah up to speed on the convoy's current status. It was making good time, moving steadily through the desert night. At its current pace, it would reach the first checkpoint where it was expected to split up within 36 hours. Once it divided, the vehicles would disperse to multiple locations, making it exponentially harder to track them all and impossible to engage them all at once. The window for action was closing rapidly. Sarah stood there for a long time, watching the infrared feed from a Predator drone circling high above the convoy. The vehicles appeared as bright white shapes against the cooler background of the desert, their heat signatures standing out clearly in the night. She counted them again, confirming the intelligence estimates. 47 vehicles in total, everything from small pickup trucks to large cargo haulers. It was a significant force, representing months of planning and resource gathering by the militia. She thought about the young soldiers on patrol who would face those weapons. She thought about the villages that would be threatened, the families who would be terrorized, the children who would grow up in fear. She thought about the mission she had sworn to accomplish when she put on the uniform, the oath she had taken to protect and defend. And she thought about the orders she had been given, the clear and unambiguous directive to do nothing. The night wore on, and Sarah eventually returned to her quarters, but sleep was elusive. She lay on her cot, staring at the metal ceiling, listening to the distant sound of generators and the occasional vehicle moving around the base. Her mind wouldn't stop working, couldn't stop analyzing the situation from every angle. This was the kind of decision that defined a career, maybe defined a life. She could follow orders, stay safe, watch the convoy complete its mission, and live with the knowledge that she had done nothing. Or she could do what she believed was right and face the consequences. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Sarah had made her decision, though she didn't fully acknowledge it to herself yet. She went through her normal routine with mechanical precision. Breakfast in the mess hall, physical training to burn off nervous energy, maintenance checks on her aircraft. Her plane was an A-10 Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Warthog, a beast of an aircraft designed specifically for close air support and ground attack. It was ugly, slow by fighter standards, and built around a massive 30 rotary cannon that could shred armored vehicles. It was exactly the kind of plane you wanted when you needed to destroy a convoy. The day passed in a haze of routine punctuated by growing tension. Sarah could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, making every moment feel significant. She checked in at the operations center multiple times, watching the convoy's progress, confirming the intelligence assessments, studying the terrain. Each time, the analysts looked at her with expressions that mixed hope and concern. They knew something was building, could sense the electricity in the air around her. Late that afternoon, Sarah requested a meeting with Colonel Harrison. She found him in his office, a small space that managed to feel both cluttered and austere. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression told her he had been expecting this conversation. He gestured for her to sit, then leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The colonel looked tired, older than his years, burdened by the weight of command in a war that seemed to have no clear ending. Sarah laid out her case with precision and passion. She detailed the intelligence on the convoy, the threat it represented, the opportunity they had to eliminate it cleanly with minimal risk. She talked about the terrain, the isolation of the target, the tactical advantages of the location. She presented alternative scenarios, showing what would happen if the convoy reached its destination, the attacks that would follow, the lives that would be lost. She argued that the risk of not acting was far greater than the risk of taking action. Colonel Harrison listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, his fingers steepled in front of his face. Finally, he spoke, and his words were measured and careful. He understood her arguments, he said. He even agreed with them. But orders were orders, and they came from people with access to information and considerations that neither of them fully understood. The political situation was complex. The stakes were high, and the decision had been made at levels far above both of their pay grades. Sarah pressed him, asking what he would do if the decision were his alone to make. The colonel's expression hardened, and for a moment she saw a flash of the younger officer he had once been. before years of bureaucracy and politics had worn him down. He told her that sometimes being a good soldier meant following orders you disagreed with, trusting the chain of command even when it seemed wrong. But he also said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that sometimes being a good person meant doing what you knew was right regardless of the consequences. They parted without any clear resolution, but Sarah understood what hadn't been said. The colonel couldn't give her permission to act, couldn't officially sanction what she was considering. But he also wasn't going to stop her, at least not immediately. What happened next would be entirely on her shoulders, her decision, her responsibility. She left his office feeling both liberated and terrified. That evening, Sarah called her parents using the satellite phone connection available for morale calls. She didn't tell them what she was considering, couldn't tell them, but she needed to hear their voices. Her mother talked about the weather back home, about the neighbors, about ordinary things that felt like they belonged to another world. Her father asked how she was doing, and she could hear the worry in his voice that he tried to hide. They told her they loved her, told her to stay safe, told her they were proud of her. She held onto those words after the call ended, knowing she might need them in the days to come. Night fell again over the desert, and Sarah made her way to the flight line where her A-10 sat waiting. The aircraft looked predatory in the dim light, all angles and purpose. She conducted her pre-flight checks with extra care, making sure everything was perfect. She loaded her personal gear, reviewed her maps, confirmed her weapons. The plane was armed with a full complement of AGM-65 Maverick missiles, designed specifically for destroying armored vehicles, plus the devastating 30 cannon that could fire over 4,000 rounds per minute. Lieutenant found her there, and they stood together in the darkness without speaking for a while. Finally, he asked her directly what she was planning to do. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, seeing the loyalty in his eyes, the readiness to follow her wherever this led. She told him the truth, that she was considering doing something that would probably end her career and might land her in prison. She said he should go back to his quarters, get some sleep, and have nothing to do with whatever came next. Shook his head and smiled, a tight expression that held no humor. He said that if she was going to throw away her career, she shouldn't have to do it alone. Besides, he said, 2 aircraft could do a lot more damage than one, and if this convoy was as dangerous as intelligence suggested, they needed to make sure they destroyed it completely. Sarah tried to argue, tried to protect him from the consequences she knew were coming, but he was adamant. They were wingmen, he said, and that meant something. As midnight approached, Sarah stood at the edge of the flight line one last time, looking up at the stars that blazed in the clear desert sky. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment, all the training and sacrifice and dedication. She thought about the oath she had taken, about duty and honor and doing what was right. And she thought about that convoy rolling through the darkness, carrying weapons that would be used to kill and terrorize. She made her decision with clarity and finality. Sometimes, she realized, the right choice and the easy choice were very different things. Sometimes being a good soldier meant knowing when to disobey orders. Sometimes protecting those who couldn't protect themselves required sacrifice. She would destroy that convoy, or the hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of Sarah's life. She sat in her quarters, going over the mission plan one more time, checking every detail, anticipating every possible complication. The surveillance feeds showed the convoy continuing its steady progress through the desert, maintaining formation, following the route that intelligence had predicted. They were disciplined and professional, which made them more dangerous but also more predictable. That predictability was something she could use. Sarah had designed the attack profile with meticulous care. She would approach from the south, using the terrain to mask her approach for as long as possible. The convoy would be moving through a narrow valley at dawn, the timing almost perfect. The low angle of the sun would make it harder for anyone on the ground to spot her aircraft against the glare. She would come in fast and low, below radar coverage, using the element of surprise to maximum effect. The initial strike would target the fuel tankers and ammunition trucks, creating chaos and blocking the convoy's ability to escape. Then she would methodically work through the remaining vehicles until nothing was left operational. Had volunteered to fly top cover, protecting her from any anti-aircraft response and helping identify targets. His aircraft was loaded differently, optimized for suppressing enemy air defenses and providing backup firepower. Together, they made a formidable team, and Sarah found comfort in knowing she wouldn't be going into this fight alone. Still, she made sure he understood the stakes. This wasn't just a dangerous mission, it was career suicide and possibly worse. Courts-martial, prison time, dishonorable discharge. All of that was on the table if things went wrong. At 3 in the morning, Sarah finally gave up trying to rest and made her way to the operations center. The place was quiet, with only a skeleton crew on duty monitoring various feeds and communications. Sergeant Williams was still there, looking tired but alert. He glanced up as Sarah entered, and something in his expression told her he knew what she was planning. He didn't say anything, just pulled up the latest surveillance imagery and walked her through the convoy's current position and projected route. The convoy had stopped for what appeared to be a rest break. The vehicles pulled off the highway in a loose defensive formation. Sarah could see figures moving around in the infrared footage, soldiers stretching their legs, checking equipment, probably grabbing food and water. They looked relaxed, confident, probably believing they were safe from attack given the political constraints that command had mentioned. That confidence would be their downfall. Sarah memorized the scene, burning every detail into her mind. These weren't just blips on a screen, they were real people, and she was about to kill them. The weight of that decision settled over her like a physical presence. Williams quietly mentioned that the convoy was expected to resume movement at dawn, which was in approximately 2 hours. The timing would put them in the valley section at exactly the moment Sarah had planned for her attack. It was almost as if fate was aligning everything perfectly, removing every excuse, every reason to hesitate. Sarah thanked him and left the operations center, heading toward the flight line where her aircraft waited in the pre-dawn darkness. The base was eerily quiet, most personnel still asleep or occupied with duties elsewhere. Sarah and met at the aircraft, both of them moving with the purposeful efficiency of professionals preparing for combat. They didn't talk much, there wasn't much left to say. They had discussed the mission parameters, rehearsed the tactics, acknowledged the risks. Now it was just a matter of execution. Sarah climbed into her cockpit, the familiar surroundings of the A-10 wrapping around her like a second skin. She had flown this particular aircraft for 6 months, knew every quirk and characteristic, trusted it completely. The pre-flight checks were completed with automatic precision, muscle memory taking over while her mind focused on the mission ahead. External power connected, systems coming online, weapons status checked, and fuel load confirmed, navigation systems programmed. Everything was green, everything was ready. Sarah strapped in, tightening the harness until it was snug against her body, then pulled on her helmet and connected the communications and oxygen systems. The heads-up display illuminated, painting critical information across the reinforced glass in front of her. She radioed the tower, requesting clearance for a training flight, which had been her cover story. The controller, sounding half asleep, granted permission without question. This was a combat zone. Aircraft took off at all hours for various reasons, and training flights were common enough not to raise suspicion. Sarah fired up the engines, feeling the powerful turbofans come to life with a rising whine that vibrated through the entire airframe. The A-10 might not be the fastest or most glamorous aircraft in the inventory, but it was built like a tank and designed to dish out devastating firepower. Took off first, his aircraft climbing into the pre-dawn sky with running lights still on to maintain the illusion of a routine flight. Sarah followed 2 minutes later, pulling her Warthog off the runway and into a climbing turn that would take them toward their target. Once they were airborne and clear of the base, both aircraft switched off all external lights and descended to low altitude, skimming over the desert terrain at speeds that would make any sane person nervous. This was where the A-10 excelled, low and slow, able to operate from altitudes where faster jets couldn't safely fly. The desert flowed beneath them in shades of gray and black, the landscape visible through night vision systems that painted the world in artificial green. Sarah flew on instinct and training, making constant tiny corrections to avoid terrain features, maintaining precise altitude and heading. The flight computer showed their target area approaching, counting down the miles and minutes. Her heart rate had settled into a steady rhythm, the pre-combat jitters giving way to the focused calm that always came over her once she was committed to action. They approached the target area from the south as planned, using it to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Sarah could see the convoy on her targeting display, the vehicles strung out along the highway in their standard formation. Intelligence had been accurate. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, moving at the predicted speed, following the route as anticipated. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, providing the exact lighting conditions Sarah had planned for. She armed her weapons systems, feeling the slight vibration as missiles went hot and the cannon system charged. The targeting computer was tracking multiple vehicles simultaneously, offering her a menu of death that she could deliver with the push of a button. Sarah selected the fuel tankers as her primary targets, 3 large vehicles clustered near the middle of the convoy. Destroying them would create massive fireballs that would light up the entire area and sow chaos among the other vehicles. It would also deny the convoy the ability to refuel, limiting their options if any vehicles managed to escape the initial attack. Called out over the radio, confirming he was in position and ready to engage. His job was to suppress any anti-aircraft response and help identify high-value targets. Sarah acknowledged, then took a deep breath and committed to the attack. She pulled up over bringing her aircraft into full view of the convoy and immediately launched 2 Maverick missiles at the lead fuel tanker. The missiles streaked away from her aircraft, leaving white contrails in the morning air, covering the distance to their target in seconds. The explosion was massive, a rolling ball of orange and black that consumed the tanker and spread outward in a wave of superheated air and debris. Secondary explosions followed as the fuel ignited, creating a pillar of fire that climbed hundreds of feet into the air. Sarah was already banking hard, lining up her next target, launching 2 more missiles at the second tanker before the first explosion had finished. The impact was equally devastating, turning the convoy route into a corridor of fire and destruction. Chaos erupted below as the militia soldiers realized they were under attack. Vehicles began breaking formation, some trying to accelerate away from the kill zone, others stopping abruptly as drivers panicked. Sarah could see figures running, abandoning their vehicles, seeking any cover they could find in the open desert. The anti-aircraft units began firing, tracers arcing up into the sky, but their aim was wild and uncoordinated. Came in from a different angle, launching missiles at the air defense vehicles, silencing their guns in brilliant explosions that sent debris spinning through the air. Sarah brought her A-10 around for another pass, this time targeting the ammunition trucks. These were priority targets, not just because of the destruction they could cause when they exploded, but because they represented the convoy's offensive capability. She lined up carefully, compensating for wind and the movement of the vehicles below, then fired. The missiles struck with precision, and the resulting explosions were even more spectacular than the fuel tankers. Ammunition cooked off in chains of secondary explosions, tracer rounds shooting off in random directions, creating a deadly fireworks display that lasted for minutes. The convoy was disintegrating before her eyes. Some vehicles were trying to escape, racing down the highway or across the open desert, but there was nowhere to hide. Sarah methodically hunted them down, switching to her cannon for the smaller targets. The 30 rounds tore through trucks and armored vehicles like they were made of paper, each burst from the gun creating a line of explosions as the high-explosive rounds detonated on impact. The sound of the cannon was distinctive, a deep buzzing roar that had earned the A-10 its nickname. Was working the northern end of the convoy, his missiles and cannon fire creating similar devastation. Together, they were orchestrating a symphony of destruction that was both terrible and necessary. Sarah felt no joy in it, no sense of triumph, only grim determination to complete the mission. These were enemy combatants carrying weapons meant to kill coalition soldiers and terrorize civilians, and she was doing what needed to be done to stop them. The attack lasted 17 minutes from first missile launch to final gun run. When it was over, the convoy that had been deemed untouchable by command was a smoking ruin spread across 3 miles of desert highway. Sarah made a final pass, using her targeting pod to assess the damage and confirm there were no intact vehicles remaining. 47 vehicles had been in that convoy, and 47 vehicles were now destroyed or disabled beyond repair. Fires burned everywhere, sending columns of black smoke into the morning sky that could probably be seen for 50 miles. Sarah pulled away from the target area, climbing to a safer altitude, her hands steady on the controls despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Joined up on her wing, and they flew in formation back toward base, neither of them speaking over the radio. What was there to say? They had just disobeyed direct orders, destroyed a target that command had specifically forbidden them to engage, and undoubtedly ended their military careers. But they had also eliminated a significant threat, probably saved countless lives, and done what they believed was right. The base came into view, the familiar cluster of buildings and aircraft surrounded by defensive positions and guard towers. Sarah could see increased activity even from a distance, vehicles moving urgently, people running. Word had obviously gotten out about what happened, probably from the surveillance feeds that had captured the entire attack. She knew what was waiting for her on the ground, the fury of commanding officers, the investigations, the potential for court-martial. None of that mattered now. What was done was done. She lined up for landing, bringing the A-10 down with the smooth precision of hundreds of previous landings. The wheels touched down on the runway, the aircraft settling onto the concrete with barely a bump. Sarah taxied to her parking spot and shut down the engines, the sudden silence feeling unnatural after the roar of combat. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, not quite ready to face what came next, then unstrapped and climbed down from the aircraft. Colonel Harrison was waiting for her on the flight line, along with several military police officers and a crowd of other personnel who had gathered to see what would happen. The colonel's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, anger and respect and resignation all mixed together. He didn't say anything as Sarah approached, just gestured for the military police to take her into custody. They were professional about it, no unnecessary roughness, just firm hands guiding her toward a waiting vehicle. Before they led her away, Sarah turned to look back at her aircraft. The A-10 sat there in the morning light, still loaded with some of its weapons, its armor from years of combat, looking every bit the warrior it was designed to be. She had trusted that aircraft with her life hundreds of times, and it had never let her down. Today had been no exception. She silently thanked it for one last successful mission, then allowed herself to be driven away toward whatever came next. The detention facility was a small building near the base headquarters, designed to hold personnel awaiting disciplinary action or investigation. Sarah was placed in a room that was sparse but not uncomfortable, with a cot, a small table, and a chair. The door was locked behind her, and she was alone with her thoughts for the first time since launching the attack. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her feeling drained and oddly peaceful. She had done what she believed was right, had accepted the consequences, and now all she could do was wait. Hours passed, marked only by the changing angle of sunlight through the small window. Sarah was brought food, which she ate mechanically, and water, which she drank gratefully. No one spoke to her beyond the basic necessities, and she didn't ask questions. She knew the military bureaucracy would take time to process what had happened, to figure out what charges to bring, to coordinate with higher headquarters about how to handle this situation. She was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Evening came, and with it Colonel Harrison. He entered the room alone, dismissed the guard, and sat down across from Sarah at the small table. For a long time he just looked at her, his expression impossible to read. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and measured. He told her that the attack on the convoy had been captured on multiple surveillance systems, that every moment was recorded and being analyzed by teams of intelligence officers and legal experts. The evidence against her was overwhelming and indisputable. But then his tone changed, became something else entirely. Reports were coming in from the field, he said, from sources within the militia organization. The convoy she had destroyed was even more important than intelligence had initially believed. It wasn't just carrying weapons and supplies. It was transporting key leadership personnel, including several high-level commanders who had been coordinating militia operations across the entire region. The convoy had also been carrying detailed plans for a series of coordinated attacks that would have targeted civilian population centers, coalition bases, and critical infrastructure. Sarah listened in silence as the colonel continued. By destroying that convoy, she had not only eliminated a significant amount of military hardware, she had decapitated the militia's leadership structure and prevented attacks that would have killed hundreds, possibly thousands of people. Coalition intelligence was already seeing the effects. Intercepted communications showed confusion and disarray among militia units. Operations were being canceled or delayed, and the entire organization was in chaos trying to reorganize after losing so many leaders at once. The room fell silent again as the implications of this information settled over both of them. Sarah had been right. The convoy had been exactly as dangerous as she believed, possibly even more so. Her decision to attack it, despite orders to the contrary, had achieved results that went far beyond anything they had hoped for. But that didn't change the fact that she had disobeyed direct orders, violated the chain of command, and taken action that could have caused an international incident if things had gone differently. Colonel Harrison stood up, preparing to leave, but paused at the door. He told Sarah that what happened next was out of his hands, that decisions about her fate were being made at levels far above his authority. But he also said, in a voice that held something like admiration, that she had done what he wished he had the courage to do. She had put mission and morality above career and safety, had made the hard choice that everyone else was afraid to make. Whatever happened to her, she should remember that she had saved lives and struck a blow against an enemy that desperately needed striking. After he left, Sarah lay down on the cot and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had destroyed 47 vehicles, killed an unknown number of enemy combatants, and changed the tactical situation in the entire region. She had also probably destroyed her career, damaged relationships with people who had trusted her, and set herself up for legal consequences that could follow her for the rest of her life. Yet despite all of that, she felt at peace with her decision. Sometimes doing the right thing required sacrifice, and she had been willing to make that sacrifice. The investigation began in earnest the following morning. Sarah was escorted from her detention room to a larger facility that had been set up specifically to handle what was already being called the incident by personnel on the base. The room was clinical and official, with a long table, recording equipment, and several stern-faced officers who represented various branches of military justice and intelligence. They weren't hostile exactly, but they weren't friendly either. This was serious business, and everyone in the room knew it. The lead investigator was a colonel, a woman in her late 40s with iron-gray hair and eyes that suggested she had seen and heard everything the military had to offer. She was methodical and thorough, taking Sarah through the events of the previous day minute by minute, asking for clarification on decisions, motivations, and actions. Sarah answered every question honestly and completely. There was no point in lying or trying to justify her actions with anything other than the truth. She had made a conscious decision to disobey orders because she believed those orders were wrong, and she was prepared to accept responsibility for that decision. The questioning lasted for hours, covering everything from her initial reaction to the briefing about the convoy, through her conversations with Colonel Harrison, to the specific details of the attack itself. They wanted to know who else had been involved, whether anyone had encouraged or supported her actions, if she had discussed her plans with anyone before executing them. Sarah was careful in her answers, trying to protect and anyone else who might have known what she was planning. This was her decision, her responsibility, and she wasn't going to drag others down with her if she could help it. Lieutenant was being questioned in a separate room. Sarah knew, going through his own interrogation about his role in the attack. She hoped he was being as careful with his words as she was being with hers, hoped they couldn't find a way to punish him too severely for standing by his wingman. The military had complicated rules about loyalty and chain of command, and she knew they would be struggling to figure out how to handle this situation. On one hand, she had violated direct orders in a way that couldn't be ignored. On the other hand, the results of her action had been spectacularly successful and had achieved strategic objectives that command had been trying to accomplish for months. During a break in the questioning, Sarah was allowed to use a phone under supervision. She called her parents, knowing they had probably heard something about the incident through military channels or news reports. Her mother answered, and Sarah could hear the worry in her voice immediately. She assured them she was safe, that she wasn't in physical danger, but that she was in some trouble and couldn't discuss the details. Her father got on the line and told her they loved her, that they supported her no matter what happened, and that she should remember she had always made them proud. Those words meant more to Sarah than any medal or commendation ever could. The investigation continued over the next several days, expanding to include dozens of interviews with personnel who had any contact with Sarah or knowledge of the convoy situation. Intelligence officers analyzed the surveillance footage of the attack, providing frame-by-frame assessment of her tactics, weapons employment, and results. Weapons systems experts examined her aircraft to verify what armaments had been used and how they had been deployed. Legal experts pored over regulations, rules of engagement, and precedent cases trying to build their understanding of the situation. What emerged from all this analysis was a picture of a mission that had been executed with near-perfect precision. Sarah had demonstrated tactical brilliance in her approach, weapons selection, and target engagement. The attack had achieved complete surprise, overwhelmed the convoy's defenses, and resulted in total destruction of all 47 vehicles with zero collateral damage and no civilian casualties. From a purely military standpoint, it was a textbook operation that could be used as a case study in effective air-to-ground combat. The problem was that it never should have happened at all according to the orders that had been in effect. Intelligence continued to come in about the aftermath of the convoy's destruction, and each new piece of information seemed to reinforce the significance of what Sarah had accomplished. The militia organization was in complete disarray, unable to coordinate operations or maintain any kind of offensive pressure. Several high-ranking leaders had indeed been killed in the attack, including 3 regional commanders and a logistics coordinator who had been irreplaceable to their operations. The weapons and equipment destroyed represented months of resource gathering and preparation, setting the militia's capabilities back by at least a year. More importantly, the detailed attack plans that had been in the convoy were now recovered from the wreckage by coalition forces who had secured the site. These plans revealed a coordinated series of attacks that would have struck a dozen targets simultaneously, including a major coalition base, 2 civilian refugee camps, and several key infrastructure points like water treatment facilities and power stations. The casualty estimates from such attacks would have been in the hundreds of civilians and possibly dozens of coalition personnel. Sarah's decision to strike the convoy had literally saved hundreds of lives. This information complicated the legal and disciplinary questions significantly. How do you court-martial someone for preventing a massacre? How do you punish a pilot whose disobedience resulted in a major strategic victory? The military justice system was not well equipped to handle situations where someone violated orders for the right reasons and achieved positive results. There were no easy answers, and Sarah could sense the tension among the investigating officers as they struggled with these questions. On the 4th day of her detention, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A 3-star general named Robert Hawkins arrived at the base, flown in specifically to deal with the situation. General Hawkins was known throughout the military as a no-nonsense officer who valued results and had little patience for bureaucratic hesitation. He was also known for protecting his people when they made tough calls, even controversial ones. His presence suggested that the decision about Sarah's fate was being taken seriously at the highest levels. The general met with Sarah privately, dismissing the guards and investigators who had been constantly present during her detention. He sat across from her with the bearing of a man who had made countless difficult decisions and lived with the consequences. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or small talk. Instead, he laid out the situation as he saw it with brutal honesty. Sarah had violated orders in a way that couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. The chain of command had to be respected, and there had to be consequences for disobedience, even when that disobedience produced positive results. However, General Hawkins continued. The military also had to acknowledge reality. The convoy attack had been a significant operational success that achieved objectives command had been unable to accomplish through approved channels. It had disrupted enemy operations, eliminated key leadership, and prevented attacks that would have caused mass casualties. To punish Sarah too harshly would send a message to other officers that initiative and operational judgment were less important than blind obedience, which was not the message the military wanted to send. The general asked Sarah a direct question. If she could go back and make the decision again, knowing what she knew now, would she do the same thing? Sarah didn't hesitate. She told him she would absolutely make the same choice. The convoy had represented a clear and present danger. The opportunity to eliminate it had been fleeting, and waiting for permission from distant commanders who didn't fully understand the tactical situation would have meant losing that opportunity. She had made a judgment call based on her assessment of the situation, and she would make that same call again. General Hawkins nodded slowly, seeming to appreciate her honesty even if he didn't necessarily agree with her reasoning. He told her that her fate was still being decided, that there were people arguing for everything from a full court-martial to immediate discharge to commendation for valor. The situation was unprecedented in many ways, and there was no clear path forward that would satisfy everyone. He advised her to be patient and prepare herself for an outcome that might not make sense to her, because the decision would ultimately be as much about politics and public relations as it was about military justice. After the general left, Sarah was moved to slightly more comfortable quarters, though she was still under guard and restricted to the building. The change in her treatment suggested that someone had decided she wasn't exactly a criminal, even if they hadn't decided she was a hero either. She was in a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor free, while the bureaucracy worked through the implications of what she had done. Lieutenant was finally allowed to visit her under supervision. He looked tired but defiant, and he told her that his interrogation had been intense, but he had stuck to the simple truth. He had made his own decision to support her mission because he believed it was the right thing to do. He wasn't going to claim he was just following orders or that he had been coerced. He had made a choice, just as she had, and he was prepared to face the consequences. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude and respect for him. In a military culture that often discouraged independent thinking, he had demonstrated both courage and integrity. They talked for a while about the investigation, about the reports coming in regarding the militia's disarray, about the lives that had probably been saved. Mentioned that Colonel Harrison was also facing scrutiny for not preventing the attack, though the colonel had apparently defended himself by pointing out that he had explicitly ordered Sarah not to engage the convoy, and that she had chosen to violate those orders. It was a legally sound defense, but everyone knew the situation was more complicated than that. Days stretched into a week, and Sarah found herself falling into a routine in detention. She exercised in her small quarters, read books that were provided to her, and spent long hours thinking about her career, her choices, and what the future might hold. She had always assumed she would be in the military for 20 years, maybe more, rising through the ranks and eventually commanding her own squadron or even higher positions. That future was gone now, evaporated in 17 minutes of combat, and she was still processing what that meant for her life. Messages began arriving from other pilots and personnel on the base, sent through official channels since she wasn't allowed direct communication. They were almost uniformly supportive, expressing admiration for her courage and gratitude for her actions. Some shared stories of times when they had felt constrained by rules of engagement or command decisions that seemed wrong, drawing parallels to her situation. Others simply wanted her to know she wasn't alone, that people understood why she had done what she did and respected her for it. These messages sustained Sarah during the uncertain days of waiting. The media had gotten wind of the story, though details were scarce due to military operational security. Reports described an unauthorized military strike that had achieved significant results, but raised questions about command and control. Some journalists were portraying Sarah as a rogue pilot who had dangerously violated orders, while others were suggesting she was a hero who had been hamstrung by bureaucratic caution. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either narrative, but Sarah knew that public perception would play a role in whatever decision was ultimately made about her fate. On the 10th day of her detention, Sarah was informed that a decision had been reached. She would be appearing before a military review board the following morning, where her case would be formally adjudicated, and her punishment or exoneration would be determined. She spent that final night in detention writing letters to her family, to Colonel Harrison, trying to express thoughts and feelings that seemed too big for words. She wanted them to understand that she had no regrets about the mission itself, only about the position her actions had put them all in. The morning of the review board arrived clear and hot, another typical day in the desert that belied the significance of what was about to happen. Sarah was escorted to the base headquarters building, where the review board had been convened in a large conference room. The board consisted of 5 senior officers, including General Hawkins, along with legal representatives and observers from various commands and agencies. The room was formal and intimidating, designed to impress upon anyone appearing before it the seriousness of military justice. Sarah stood at attention as the charges against her were read aloud. Violation of direct orders, unauthorized use of military assets, engaging a target without proper authorization, and several other technical violations of military regulations. Each charge was serious on its own, and together they represented a case that could result in dishonorable discharge, reduction in rank, and possibly prison time. The reading of the charges took several minutes, and Sarah maintained her military bearing throughout, acknowledging each charge with a simple affirmation that she understood what she was being accused of. Then came the presentation of evidence, which was extensive. The board heard testimony from intelligence officers about the convoy's composition and the threat it represented. They reviewed surveillance footage of the attack itself, watching Sarah's precise execution of the mission. They examined the recovered plans from the convoy wreckage, seeing the attacks that would have been carried out if Sarah hadn't acted. They heard from Colonel Harrison about the orders he had given and Sarah's decision to violate them. They reviewed her service record, her previous commendations, her reputation among her peers. The lead prosecutor, a stern major from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, made a compelling case that regardless of the results, Sarah had violated fundamental principles of military discipline. The chain of command existed for good reasons, he argued, and allowing individual officers to simply ignore orders they disagreed with would lead to chaos and potentially catastrophic consequences. Today, Sarah might have been right, but what about next time when an officer made a similar decision and was wrong? The precedent this case set mattered immensely, and the board needed to send a clear message that orders were not optional. The defense attorney, a lieutenant colonel who had been assigned to Sarah's case, presented a different perspective. She argued that Sarah had been placed in an impossible situation by command's decision to declare the convoy untouchable despite clear intelligence about the threat it represented. She emphasized the strategic results of the attack, the lives saved, and the damage done to enemy capabilities. She suggested that Sarah had exercised proper military judgment in a rapidly evolving tactical situation, and that her actions, while technically in violation of orders, were consistent with her ultimate mission to protect coalition forces and civilian populations. Sarah was given the opportunity to make a statement on her own behalf. She stood and faced the board, looking each officer in the eye before she spoke. She acknowledged that she had violated orders, that she had known she was violating them when she launched the attack, and that she had understood the potential consequences. She explained her reasoning, the intelligence she had reviewed, the opportunity she saw to eliminate a significant threat, and the judgment call she made that waiting for permission would mean losing that opportunity. She concluded by saying she had joined the military to protect people, and in that moment, attacking the convoy had been the best way she knew to fulfill that purpose. The board deliberated for 3 hours while Sarah waited in an adjacent room, trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. Finally, she was called back in to hear the verdict. General Hawkins, as the senior member of the board, delivered the decision. The board had found her guilty of the charges as presented, which wasn't surprising since she had openly admitted to everything. However, the board had also taken into account the exceptional circumstances, the positive results, and her distinguished service record. The sentence was carefully crafted to send multiple messages. Sarah would receive a formal letter of reprimand that would become part of her permanent record. She would be removed from flight status for a period of 6 months, during which she would undergo additional training on rules of engagement, and command pro the verdict hit Sarah with a complexity of emotions she hadn't anticipated. Relief that she wasn't facing the worst possible outcomes mixed with frustration at being grounded and uncertainty about what this meant for her future. The letter of reprimand was a permanent black mark, something that would follow her for the rest of her military career and beyond. Every time someone reviewed her record, they would see it and make judgments about her reliability, her judgment, her fitness for command. But she was still in the military, still a pilot, and still had the opportunity to continue serving if she could navigate the next 6 months successfully. General Hawkins pulled her aside after the formal proceedings concluded, speaking to her away from the other board members and observers. He told her that the verdict had been the result of intense debate and negotiation among various stakeholders with different agendas. Some had wanted to make an example of her, to demonstrate that even successful violations of orders would be punished harshly. Others had wanted to quietly commend her and move on, recognizing that she had done what needed to be done. The compromise they had reached satisfied no one completely, which probably meant it was the right decision. The general offered Sarah some advice that felt both pragmatic and slightly cynical. The military, he explained, was a large organization with competing priorities and perspectives. Her case would be interpreted differently by different people. Some would see her as a maverick who needed to be watched carefully. Others would see her as exactly the kind of officer they wanted in combat situations, someone who could make tough calls under pressure. Her challenge would be to demonstrate that she had learned the right lessons from this experience, while not losing the qualities that made her an effective combat pilot. Sarah was released from detention that afternoon and returned to regular quarters, though with certain restrictions on her movements and activities. She was no longer allowed on the flight line or in operational areas, which felt like a physical separation from the work she loved. Instead, she was assigned to administrative duties and began the training program that had been mandated as part of her sentence. The training covered rules of engagement in exhaustive detail, the importance of chain of command, proper procedures for questioning orders, and historical case studies of situations where operational decisions had gone wrong. The training was taught by a captain from the Judge Advocate General's Corps named Michael Stevens, a thoughtful man who approached the material with more nuance than Sarah had expected. Rather than simply lecturing her about obedience, he engaged her in discussions about the difficult balance between following orders and exercising independent judgment. He shared cases where pilots had followed orders that later proved catastrophically wrong, and cases where pilots had deviated from orders with disastrous results. The message was clear. There were no easy answers, and every situation required careful judgment. During one particularly memorable session, Captain Stevens asked Sarah to walk him through her decision-making process before the convoy attack. She explained how she had gathered intelligence, assessed the threat, evaluated the tactical opportunity, considered the political constraints, and ultimately concluded that the military necessity of destroying the convoy outweighed the career risks of violating orders. Stevens listened carefully, then asked her a question that made her think. If 10 other pilots had been given the same information and situation, would they have made the same choice she made, or was her decision an outlier? Sarah had to admit that most pilots probably wouldn't have made her choice, that most would have followed orders and accepted the frustration of watching a legitimate target escape. Stevens nodded and suggested that this was actually the key issue. Military operations depended on consistency and predictability. If every pilot made their own judgment calls about when orders applied, and when they didn't, chaos would result. The fact that Sarah's judgment happened to be correct in this instance didn't change the fundamental problem with the precedent her actions set. Yet Stevens also acknowledged, in a moment of candor, that there were situations where rigid adherence to orders could produce worse outcomes than thoughtful deviation from them. Military history was full of examples where junior officers had shown initiative that saved lives or achieved objectives that wouldn't have been possible if they had waited for explicit authorization. The art of military leadership, he suggested, was knowing which situations called for strict obedience and which called for intelligent flexibility. That judgment couldn't be taught from a manual. It had to be developed through experience and reflection. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself settling into the strange routine of her grounded existence. She attended training sessions, performed her administrative duties competently if not enthusiastically, and tried to maintain her physical fitness and mental sharpness for the eventual return to flight status. She wasn't allowed to fly, but she could study tactics, review mission footage, and stay current on procedures and systems. She spent hours in the squadron ready room when it was empty, reading technical manuals and intelligence briefings, keeping her mind engaged with the work even though she couldn't actively participate. Lieutenant had received a similar but less severe sentence for his role in the convoy attack. He too had been grounded temporarily and assigned to training, though his letter of reprimand was less harsh given that Sarah had been clearly identified as the mission leader and primary decision-maker. They saw each other regularly during training sessions and occasionally shared meals in the dining facility, though they were careful not to be seen as conspiring or undermining their punishment. Their friendship had been tested and strengthened by the experience, bound together by shared consequences of a difficult choice. The other pilots in the squadron treated Sarah with a mixture of respect and caution. Some clearly admired what she had done and made subtle efforts to show their support. Others seemed uncomfortable around her, perhaps worried that associating with her might damage their own careers, or perhaps genuinely believing she had been wrong to violate orders. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel who had replaced the previous commander shortly after the incident, maintained strict professional distance, neither praising nor criticizing her, but making clear that she would be held to the highest standards during her probationary period. The intelligence community continued to produce reports about the aftermath of the convoy destruction, and these reports consistently confirmed the strategic importance of what Sarah had accomplished. The militia organization had effectively collapsed as a fighting force, unable to coordinate operations or maintain pressure on coalition positions. Several splinter groups had emerged, fighting among themselves for control and resources, which further degraded their overall effectiveness. Coalition casualties in the region had dropped dramatically in the months following the attack, a statistical outcome that represented real lives saved. One particularly significant report detailed the interrogation of a militia member who had been captured several weeks after the convoy attack. This individual had been a logistics coordinator working with the convoy's leadership, and he provided detailed information about the planned attacks that had been thwarted. The targets included a refugee camp housing over 3,000 civilians, mostly women and children who had fled fighting in other areas. The planned attack would have involved truck bombs and coordinated small arms fire, designed to maximize casualties and terrorize the civilian population. Sarah read this report alone in her quarters and felt a profound sense of vindication mixed with horror at what had been prevented. Colonel Harrison, who had also faced scrutiny for his role in the incident, was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing but announced his retirement shortly thereafter. Sarah suspected the stress of the investigation and the political maneuvering around the case had taken their toll on him. Before he left, he met with Sarah one final time. They talked about leadership, about the weight of command decisions, about the toll that warfare took on everyone involved. Harrison told her that he admired her courage even while questioning her judgment, and that she had reminded him of why he had joined the military in the first place, to protect people and make a difference. The media attention on Sarah's case eventually faded as other stories captured public interest. But within military circles, her actions continued to be debated and analyzed. She became a case study in military ethics courses, her decision to attack the convoy used as a teaching example to illustrate the tensions between obedience and initiative. Some instructors held her up as an example of courageous leadership, while others used her case to demonstrate the dangers of individual decision-making that bypassed proper authority. Sarah found it strange to be a theoretical example while still living through the practical consequences of her choices. As her 6-month grounding period approached its midpoint, Sarah began to think seriously about her future. The letter of reprimand would limit her promotion opportunities, and she knew that some doors in her career were now permanently closed. She would probably never command a squadron or reach senior leadership positions. But she could still fly, could still serve, could still do meaningful work if she was willing to accept a more limited career trajectory. She had to decide whether that was enough, whether she could find satisfaction in knowing she had done the right thing even if it cost her professional advancement. During this period of reflection, Sarah received an unexpected message from a journalist named, who had been covering military affairs for a major news organization. Requested an interview, promising fair treatment and an opportunity for Sarah to tell her story in her own words. Sarah was initially hesitant, knowing that any public statements could be used against her or create additional complications. But after discussing it with military public affairs officers and receiving grudging permission, she agreed to a limited interview with strict ground rules about what could and couldn't be discussed. The interview took place in a nondescript conference room on the base, with a public affairs officer present to ensure Sarah didn't violate operational security or say anything that would cause further problems. Proved to be a thoughtful interviewer who asked probing questions but listened carefully to the answers. She wanted to understand not just what Sarah had done, but why she had done it, what she had felt in the moments before making her decision, and how she processed the aftermath. Sarah found herself opening up more than she had expected, talking about the weight of command, the responsibility she felt to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and the impossibility of making perfect decisions with imperfect information under time pressure. She talked about the faces of her fellow pilots, knowing that some of them might be killed by the weapons that Convoy was transporting if she let it pass. She talked about the civilian refugees who would have been murdered if those planned attacks had been carried out. She tried to articulate the gut-level certainty she had felt that destroying the convoy was necessary, even if she couldn't prove it with mathematical precision. Asked her if she had any regrets, and Sarah answered honestly. She regretted the pain and complications her decision had caused for people like Colonel Harrison and Lieutenant, who had been caught up in the aftermath. She regretted the strain it had put on her family, who worried about her constantly. She regretted that she had been put in a position where violating orders seemed like the only viable option. But she didn't regret destroying the convoy, didn't regret taking action when action was needed, and wouldn't apologize for making the judgment call she believed was correct. The article that eventually ran was surprisingly balanced, presenting multiple perspectives on Sarah's actions while allowing her voice to come through clearly. It generated renewed discussion about military decision-making, rules of engagement, and the balance between centralized control and tactical flexibility. Some readers saw Sarah as a hero who had saved lives, while others saw her as a dangerous precedent of insubordination. The military leadership viewed the article with mixed feelings, appreciating that it had been handled professionally, but wishing the case would fade from public consciousness. As Sarah passed the 4-month mark of her grounding, she began preparing seriously for her return to flight status. She studied aircraft systems, reviewed combat tactics, practiced emergency procedures in her mind, and maintained her physical conditioning. She knew that when she finally got back in the cockpit, she would be under intense scrutiny. Every mission would be watched closely, every decision analyzed, every action judged not just on its own merits but in the context of her history. She would have to prove that she could follow orders while maintaining the operational judgment that made her an effective combat pilot. The squadron welcomed several new pilots during this time, young officers fresh from training who knew Sarah's story but hadn't been present for the actual events. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, uncertain how to relate to someone who had become a controversial figure. Sarah tried to be approachable and professional, offering advice when asked, but not forcing her presence on people who seemed uncomfortable around her. She understood that she would have to rebuild trust and prove herself all over again. One of these new pilots, a lieutenant named Jennifer, sought Sarah out specifically to talk about the convoy incident. Explained that she had written a paper about the case during her ethics training, and she wanted to understand Sarah's perspective firsthand. They ended up having a long conversation about decision-making under pressure, about moral responsibility, and about the complexities of military service. Shared that she had been inspired by Sarah's willingness to accept consequences for doing what she believed was right, and that she hoped to have that kind of courage if she ever faced a similar situation. Sarah found this conversation both humbling and energizing. She realized that regardless of the official verdict or the letter of reprimand in her file, her actions had resonated with people and sparked important conversations about values and leadership. Maybe that was worth something. Maybe that would be her real legacy from this incident. Not the number of vehicles destroyed or the tactical success of the mission, but the example she had set of wrestling with difficult choices and being willing to stand by her convictions. The training period concluded with a comprehensive evaluation that tested Sarah's understanding of rules of engagement, command protocols, and tactical decision-making. She performed well, demonstrating that she had internalized the lessons about proper channels and appropriate escalation procedures. But the evaluators also noted in their report that she maintained the independent thinking and operational judgment that made her a valuable combat pilot. The evaluation recommended her return to flight status, with the caveat that she be monitored closely during her initial missions back. General Hawkins personally signed off on Sarah's return to flight status, adding a handwritten note to her file that expressed confidence in her ability to serve effectively while operating within proper guidelines. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Sarah, suggesting that at least some senior leadership believed in her potential for continued service. She received the notification on a Thursday afternoon, and she allowed herself a moment of pure joy before the reality of what came next set in. The night before her first flight back, Sarah lay in her quarters thinking about everything that had happened in the past 6 months. She had been grounded, punished, investigated, analyzed, and debated. She had become a case study and a cautionary tale. Her career had been permanently altered, her record marked with a reprimand that would follow her forever. Yet she had also saved hundreds of lives, disrupted enemy operations, and demonstrated that sometimes doing the right thing required personal sacrifice. Sarah thought about the convoy, those 47 vehicles that command had declared untouchable. She thought about the explosions, the destruction, the finality of what she had done. She thought about the militia leaders who had died, the weapons that had been destroyed, the attacks that had been prevented. She thought about the refugee camp that still stood, full of families who would never know how close they had come to disaster. And she thought about the choice she had made, standing at that crossroads between obedience and action, between safety and sacrifice. Tomorrow she would fly again, and the sky would feel like freedom after months on the ground. But tonight, she simply acknowledged the truth of what she had learned. Sometimes the morning Sarah returned to flight status dawned with the same relentless desert heat that had been her constant companion for the past 14 months. She woke before her alarm, nervous energy making sleep impossible after 4 in the morning. The familiar pre-flight routine felt both comfortable and strange after 6 months away from it. She dressed carefully in her flight suit, each movement deliberate, trying to recapture the mindset of a combat pilot rather than someone who had spent half a year pushing papers and sitting through ethics lectures. The walk to the flight line felt longer than she remembered. Personnel she passed offered nods of acknowledgement, some friendly and some neutral. Sarah kept her expression professional, not wanting to project either arrogance or uncertainty. She was simply a pilot returning to duty, nothing more and nothing less. The fact that her last flight had ended with her being detained and investigated was history. a chapter that had closed with the completion of her training and the restoration of her flight status. Her aircraft was waiting exactly where she had left it 6 months ago, though it had obviously been maintained and flown by other pilots during her absence. The looked the same as always, ugly and functional, built for the unglamorous work of close air support and ground attack. Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection with extra care, checking every system twice, making sure everything was perfect. This first flight back would be watched closely by her squadron commander, and probably by higher-ups who wanted to see if she could be trusted in the cockpit again. The mission briefing was straightforward, a routine patrol over a sector that had been relatively quiet in recent months. Sarah would fly with a 3-ship formation, with her serving as number 2 while a more senior pilot led. It was a deliberate choice by the squadron commander to ease her back into operations rather than giving her a leadership role immediately. Sarah understood the reasoning and didn't argue. She needed to prove she could follow as well as lead, that she could work within the team's structure rather than making unilateral decisions. The other pilots in the formation were professionals who kept things cordial but businesslike during the briefing. There was none of the casual banter that usually characterized these sessions, and Sarah sensed that everyone was being careful about what they said around her. She was still the pilot who had violated orders and gotten away with it relatively lightly, which made her presence in the formation a reminder of uncomfortable questions about authority and obedience. It would take time to rebuild the easy camaraderie that made squadron life bearable, and Sarah accepted that she would have to earn her way back into that community. Taking off felt like a religious experience after 6 months grounded. The moment the wheels left the runway and Sarah was airborne again, something inside her relaxed that had been tense for months. This was where she belonged, in the sky, doing the job she had trained for and loved. The A-10 responded to her inputs with familiar precision, and within minutes she had settled into the formation, maintaining proper spacing and heading while her mind processed the dozens of small details that made up combat flying. The patrol sector was a stretch of desert and scattered villages that had once been hotly contested, but had become relatively peaceful after the militia's collapse following the convoy destruction. Sarah could see the evidence of past fighting below, abandoned checkpoints and damaged buildings, but there was also new construction and signs of life returning to normal. Children played in village squares, farmers worked their fields, and vehicles moved on the roads without the constant fear of ambush. It was a tangible reminder of why the convoy mission had mattered, why taking that risk had produced real benefits for real people. The radio crackled with routine communications, pilots checking in with each other and with ground controllers, maintaining awareness of their positions and status. Sarah participated in the communications dance with professional precision, her transmissions clear and concise. She was that this mission was being recorded and evaluated, that people were listening to assess whether she could be trusted to operate properly. She wasn't going to give them any reason for concern, wasn't going to deviate from procedures or freelance in any way. 2 hours into the patrol, the formation received a call about a suspicious vehicle convoy that had been spotted by ground forces in an adjacent sector. Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the word convoy, the psychological association immediate and powerful. But this convoy was different. Just 3 civilian trucks that appeared to be transporting agricultural goods, and ground forces simply wanted aerial confirmation before allowing them to proceed through a checkpoint. It was routine work, the kind of verification mission that pilots flew dozens of times without incident. The formation leader directed Sarah to break off and conduct the visual inspection while the others maintained patrol. It was a vote of confidence, a sign that despite her recent history, she was still trusted with tactical responsibilities. Sarah acknowledged the order and adjusted her course, descending to get a better view of the vehicles in question. She approached from the side, using angles that would let her see the trucks clearly while maintaining safe altitude and speed. The trucks were exactly what they appeared to be: commercial vehicles with no military characteristics or suspicious modifications. Sarah reported her findings over the radio, providing detailed observations that ground forces could use to clear the vehicles through the checkpoint. The formation leader acknowledged her report, and Sarah climbed back to rejoin the group. It was a small moment, perhaps 30 seconds of actual inspection work, but it felt significant. She had been given a task, executed it professionally, and reported back without any drama or controversy. It was exactly what she needed to do, proving through hundreds of small actions that she could be the pilot the military needed her to be. The remainder of the patrol was uneventful, just hours of flying over terrain while maintaining awareness and responding to occasional requests for visual confirmation of various things on the ground. Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of it, the meditative quality of flight combined with the constant low-level vigilance that combat zones required. Her muscles remembered the feel of the controls. Her mind processed the tactical picture automatically, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt fully herself again. Landing back at base was smooth, a perfect touchdown that made Sarah smile despite her attempts to maintain professional detachment. She taxied to her parking spot, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a moment before climbing out. The mission had gone exactly as it should have, routine and professional, with no incidents or problems. It wasn't the dramatic combat mission she had flown 6 months ago, but it was in many ways more important. She had proven she could be trusted to fly the boring missions, follow the routine procedures, and operate within the system. The debrief with the squadron commander was thorough but not hostile. They reviewed the mission timeline, discussed her performance, and evaluated whether there were any issues or concerns. The commander acknowledged that she had flown well and followed all procedures correctly, which was exactly what he had needed to see. He also made clear that she would continue to be evaluated closely for the foreseeable future, that her return to flight status was conditional on continued demonstration of good judgment and adherence to protocols. Sarah accepted this feedback without argument, understanding that trust had to be rebuilt gradually. Over the following weeks, Sarah flew mission after mission, accumulating flight hours and slowly rebuilding her reputation within the squadron. Each mission was similar to the first: Routine patrols, occasional ground support calls, visual inspections of suspicious activity that almost always turned out to be innocent. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and Sarah approached it with the same professionalism she had brought to every mission throughout her career. She filed proper reports, followed all procedures, communicated clearly with other aircraft and ground forces, and demonstrated that she was a reliable team member. Lieutenant returned to flight status around the same time, and they occasionally flew together when mission assignments allowed. Their shared experience of the convoy incident and its aftermath had created a bond that went beyond normal professional relationships. They understood each other in ways that other pilots couldn't, having faced consequences together and emerged on the other side. When they flew together, there was an unspoken trust and coordination that came from knowing they had each other's backs regardless of what came. The military bureaucracy continued to process the aftermath of the convoy incident in various ways. A new set of guidelines was issued regarding rules of engagement in politically sensitive areas, attempting to balance the need for tactical flexibility with the requirement for proper authorization. Some of these guidelines seem to have been directly influenced by Sarah's case, creating slightly more permissive conditions for pilots to engage targets when time-sensitive opportunities arose. It was a small change, but Sarah recognized it as an acknowledgement that the rigid restrictions that had declared the convoy untouchable had been problematic. Intelligence reports continued to track the long-term effects of the convoy's destruction on the regional security situation. The militia organization had fractured into multiple competing groups, none of which had the resources or coordination to mount significant operations. Coalition casualties in the region had dropped by over 70% compared to the period before the convoy attack, a statistical outcome that translated to dozens of soldiers and hundreds of civilians whose lives had been saved. The refugee camp that would have been targeted was now home to over 4,000 people, and there had been discussions about transitioning it to permanent housing as the security situation improved. Sarah received an unusual visitor one afternoon several months after returning to flight status. A State Department official named Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had been involved in the political deliberations about the convoy, requested a private meeting. They met in a conference room away from the main operational areas, and Dr. Warren explained that she had been one of the voices arguing for the convoy to remain untouchable due to diplomatic considerations. She wanted Sarah to understand the civilian perspective, the concerns about international relations, and the delicate balance of alliances that had driven the decision to restrict military action. It was a surprisingly candid conversation, with Dr. Warren acknowledging that in hindsight the political concerns about attacking the convoy had been overweighted compared to the military necessity. The intelligence about what was actually being transported and the attacks that were planned had not been fully communicated to civilian decision-makers, partly due to classification issues and partly due to simple bureaucratic failures. Dr. Warren said she had reviewed the case extensively and come to believe that Sarah's decision, while technically wrong from a process standpoint, had produced better outcomes than following the approved approach would have achieved. This conversation helped Sarah understand the complexity of the environment in which military decisions were made. There were legitimate reasons why civilian leaders wanted oversight and control of military actions, reasons rooted in democratic principles and the civilian control of the military. But there were also real problems when that oversight became so restrictive that it prevented effective military operations or put soldiers and civilians at unnecessary risk. The challenge was finding the right balance, and Sarah's case had highlighted how difficult that balance could be to achieve. As time passed and Sarah continued to fly effective missions, the squadron slowly accepted her back into their community. The wariness gradually faded, replaced by the normal professional relationships that characterized military units. New pilots arriving at the squadron knew her story but treated her as just another experienced pilot rather than a controversial figure. Sarah found herself being assigned more complex missions and eventually being placed back in leadership positions for certain operations. The letter of reprimand remained in her file, but it was starting to feel like ancient history rather than a current issue. One significant mission came 8 months after Sarah's return to flight status. Intelligence had identified a weapons cache that was being used by one of the militia splinter groups to support their limited operations. The cache needed to be destroyed, but its location near civilian structures made it a sensitive target requiring careful planning and precise execution. Sarah was assigned as the mission commander, responsible for leading a 4-ship formation to destroy the cache while minimizing any collateral damage. The mission planning was exhaustive, with Sarah working closely with intelligence officers, legal advisors, and her fellow pilots to develop an approach that would be both effective and politically defensible. They studied satellite imagery, mapped out approach angles, calculated weapons effects, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. Sarah was conscious that this mission was in some ways a test of whether she had learned the proper lessons from the Convoy incident, whether she could plan and execute a sensitive mission while working within all the established guidelines and procedures. The mission itself was executed perfectly. Sarah led her formation to the target area, coordinated with ground forces to confirm that civilians were clear of the danger zone, and supervised the precise strikes that destroyed the weapons cache without damaging nearby structures. The entire operation was conducted exactly according to plan, with proper authorization at every step and thorough communication with higher headquarters throughout. It was a textbook example of how sensitive missions should be conducted, and Sarah received commendations from multiple levels of command for her leadership and execution. This successful mission marked a turning point in how Sarah was perceived within the military. She was no longer primarily seen as the pilot who had violated orders, but rather as an experienced combat aviator who had demonstrated both tactical expertise and the ability to operate within proper guidelines. The Convoy incident became part of her history rather than the defining element of her reputation. New pilots coming into the squadron heard stories about her flying skills and mission planning abilities, with the convoy attack mentioned as an interesting historical footnote rather than the central narrative. Sarah's family visited during a period when the base allowed family visits for deployed personnel. It was the first time she had seen them in person since before the convoy incident, and the reunion was emotional. Her parents looked older than she remembered, weathered by the stress of worrying about her through the investigation and its aftermath. Her brother, still serving in the Navy, had arranged his leave to coincide with their visit. They spent several days together, carefully avoiding too much discussion of the controversial mission while focusing on normal family topics and simply enjoying being together. During a quiet moment alone with her father, Sarah finally opened up about the toll the past year had taken on her. She talked about the stress of the investigation, the isolation of being grounded, the difficulty of rebuilding trust within the squadron. She admitted that there had been moments when she wondered if making the right choice had been worth the personal cost. Her father listened quietly, then reminded her of something he had told her years ago when she first joined the military, that the measure of a person wasn't whether they made mistakes, but whether they had the courage to do difficult things when those things needed doing. As Sarah approached the one-year anniversary of the convoy attack, she found herself reflecting on everything that had changed since that morning when she had climbed into her A-10 and made the decision to disobey orders. Her career trajectory had definitely been altered, the letter of reprimand ensuring she would never reach the senior command positions she might have achieved otherwise. But she was still flying, still serving, still making a difference. The region where she operated was measurably safer than it had been before the convoy's destruction, and she knew that her actions had contributed directly to that improved security situation. The anniversary date arrived with little fanfare, just another day of operations in an ongoing military deployment. Sarah flew a routine patrol mission, returned to base, filed her reports, and went about her duties like any other day. But privately, she acknowledged the significance of the date and what it represented. 1 year ago, she had destroyed 47 vehicles that command had declared untouchable. 1 year ago, she had made a choice that cost her professionally but saved lives. 1 year ago, she had learned that sometimes being a good soldier meant being willing to accept consequences for doing what you believed was right. Lieutenant Jennifer, the young pilot who had sought out Sarah months earlier, approached her after the mission that day, had been flying more complex combat missions and was growing into a skilled aviator in her own right. She thanked Sarah for the example she had set, not just in the convoy attack, but in how she had handled the aftermath. Said that watching Sarah rebuild her career and prove herself again had taught her more about leadership and resilience than any classroom lecture could have. It was a reminder that Sarah's legacy would be measured not just by the tactical success of one mission, but by the example she set for the next generation of military aviators. The operational tempo remained high as Sarah entered her 18th month of deployment, with regular missions supporting ground forces and conducting surveillance over contested areas. The militia splinter groups occasionally attempted small-scale attacks, but they lacked the coordination and resources to pose serious threats. The coalition presence was gradually being reduced as local forces took over more security responsibilities, a sign that the overall strategy was working. Sarah knew that her deployment would eventually end, that she would rotate back to a stationary assignment or possibly leave the military entirely when her current service obligation concluded. She had begun thinking about her future after the military, what kind of life she wanted to build when she finally hung up the flight suit. The letter of reprimand had closed certain doors, but it had also freed her from the pressure of climbing the promotion ladder and opened up possibilities she might not have considered otherwise. She could pursue civilian aviation, work in defense contracting, teach at military institutions, or do something completely different. The choice was hers, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't making decisions based primarily on what would look best on her service record. One particularly meaningful mission came near the end of Sarah's deployment. She was assigned to provide air support for a humanitarian convoy bringing medical supplies to remote villages that had been isolated by fighting. The convoy traveled through terrain that still had some security risks, and Sarah's job was to maintain overwatch and respond if any threats emerged. It was a stark contrast to destroying a convoy of enemy vehicles, instead protecting a convoy that was bringing help to people who needed it desperately. Sarah found deep satisfaction in this mission, using her skills and her aircraft to enable acts of compassion rather than just conducting acts of destruction. The humanitarian convoy completed its mission without incident, delivering supplies that would help treat diseases and injuries in communities that had limited access to medical care. The aid workers coordinated with Sarah's aircraft to confirm safe routes and ensure no threats were present. After the mission, one of the aid workers sent a message through official channels thanking the air support team for making the convoy possible. It was a small gesture, but it reminded Sarah that military force could be used to protect and enable humanitarian work, not just to destroy enemy capabilities. As Sarah's deployment drew toward its conclusion, the squadron held a traditional ceremony to recognize pilots who had completed their tour. Sarah was honored alongside a dozen other aviators, each of whom had contributed to the mission over many months of operations. The squadron commander gave a speech about dedication and service, carefully avoiding any specific reference to the convoy incident, but acknowledging that every pilot in the room had faced difficult decisions and challenging circumstances. Sarah received the same standard decorations as the other pilots, no special recognition, but also no indication that she was being treated differently. Colonel Harrison, who had retired months earlier but maintained contact with Sarah, sent her a letter that arrived just before her departure from the deployment. In it, he reflected on their shared experience with the convoy incident and what it had taught him about leadership. He wrote that he had spent years learning to navigate the bureaucracy and politics of military command, becoming skilled at managing up to higher headquarters and protecting his people from unnecessary scrutiny. But Sarah's decision had reminded him that sometimes all that careful management and political skill was less important than simple courage to do what needed doing. The letter continued with Harrison's observation that military organizations needed both types of officers: the managers who could navigate complex bureaucracies and maintain institutional stability, and the operators who could make tough calls under pressure when situations demanded immediate action. The challenge was creating a system that valued both types while preventing either from dominating to the exclusion of the other. He suggested that Sarah's case, despite all the controversy and difficulty, might actually help the military find a better balance between those competing needs. Sarah's final flight in the combat zone was bittersweet, a routine patrol over familiar terrain that she had come to know intimately over 18 months. She took her time, savoring the experience of flying in this environment, knowing that while she would fly again, it would never be quite the same as this. The desert stretched below her in endless variation, beautiful and harsh and indifferent to human conflicts. She had become part of this landscape, had left her mark on it through hundreds of missions and one particularly significant attack that had changed the course of local events. Landing for the last time at the forward operating base, Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. She had survived a deployment that had tested her physically, mentally, and morally. She had faced consequences for her actions and emerged with her career damaged but intact. She had proven that she could continue to serve effectively despite the controversy surrounding her. Most importantly, she had learned profound lessons about leadership, judgment, and the costs of doing what you believed was right even when others disagreed. The journey home was long, a series of transport flights that carried Sarah and her fellow returning service members back across oceans and continents to military bases in their home country. She slept fitfully on the flights, her mind already shifting from combat operations to whatever came next in her life and career. The transition from war zone to peacetime existence was always jarring, requiring mental and emotional adjustments that took time and conscious effort. Sarah knew from previous deployments that the first weeks home would be challenging as she readjusted to a different pace of life. Arriving back at her home base, Sarah went through the standard reintegration process: medical evaluations, mental health screenings, briefings about benefits and resources, and administrative processing to officially conclude her deployment status. The base psychologist who interviewed her was particularly interested in how she had processed the stress of the investigation and grounding, wanting to ensure she had dealt with those experiences in healthy ways. Sarah was honest about the difficulty of that period, while also explaining how it had ultimately led to personal growth and clarified her values and priorities. Her new assignment was to a training squadron, where she would be instructing the next generation of A-10 pilots in close air support and ground attack tactics. It was a significant position that recognized her expertise while also keeping her in a role where her controversial history was less likely to cause complications. Teaching would allow her to share the tactical lessons she had learned over hundreds of combat missions, helping ensure that new pilots could operate effectively while avoiding some of the mistakes she had made. Sarah accepted the assignment with genuine enthusiasm, recognizing it as an opportunity to give back to the military aviation community. The training squadron operated from a base in the southwestern United States, an area of desert terrain that reminded Sarah of deployment zones, but without the constant tension and danger of combat operations. She settled into her new role quickly, discovering that she enjoyed teaching more than she had expected. The student pilots were eager and talented, and Sarah found satisfaction in watching them develop skills and confidence. She was tough but fair as an instructor, demanding excellence while providing the support and guidance that helped students achieve it. Sarah's approach to teaching was heavily influenced by her own experiences, including the Convoy incident. She emphasized the importance of judgment and decision-making under pressure, but she also stressed the necessity of understanding and respecting rules of engagement and command structures. She used case studies extensively, including occasionally discussing her own case when it was relevant to the lesson being taught. She didn't glorify what she had done or present herself as a hero, but rather as someone who had faced an impossible choice and was still processing the implications of the decision she made. The student pilots responded well to this honest approach. They appreciated Sarah's willingness to discuss difficult topics and acknowledge her own mistakes and uncertainties. Several students told her that her candor about the challenges of military service had given them a more realistic and nuanced understanding of what they were preparing for. One student wrote in an evaluation that Sarah had taught him that being a good military officer wasn't about never making mistakes or never questioning orders, but about trying to do the right thing even when it was difficult and accepting responsibility for the outcomes of your choices. Time passed, and Sarah found herself building a new normal in her post-deployment life. The intensity of combat operations faded from everyday consciousness, though it remained accessible when needed for teaching purposes. She developed routines and relationships outside the military, reconnecting with civilian friends and exploring interests that had been neglected during deployment. She dated occasionally, though finding someone who understood the military lifestyle and could accept her history was challenging. She stayed in close contact with her family, visiting them regularly and working to maintain the connections that had sustained her through difficult times. The letter of reprimand remained in her file, a permanent record of the Convoy incident that was reviewed whenever she was considered for promotions or new assignments. It cost her several opportunities over the years, positions she would have been competitive for if not for that black mark on her record. Each time it happened, Sarah felt a flash of frustration, but she also reminded herself that she had known the likely consequences when she made her decision. The reprimand was the price she had paid for doing what she believed was right, and she accepted that price as worth paying. Several years after the Convoy incident, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a military ethics conference being held at a prestigious service academy. The organizers wanted her to discuss decision-making under pressure and the challenges of balancing obedience with initiative. Sarah was initially hesitant, not wanting to present herself as some kind of expert on ethics when her own actions had been so controversial. But after discussing it with trusted colleagues and mentors, She decided to accept the invitation as an opportunity to contribute to important conversations about military leadership and values. The presentation Sarah prepared was thoughtful and nuanced, avoiding simple answers or self-justification. She walked the audience through the convoy situation, explaining the intelligence, the orders, the tactical opportunity, and the judgment call she had made. She discussed the consequences, both positive outcomes like lives saved and negative outcomes like her damaged career. She acknowledged the legitimate arguments on both sides of whether her decision had been correct. Most importantly, she emphasized that there were no easy formulas for making these kinds of decisions, that each situation required careful judgment that balanced multiple competing values and priorities. The questions after Sarah's presentation were intense and probing. Students challenged her reasoning, asked what she would do differently if faced with a similar situation, and questioned whether her example set a dangerous precedent for military discipline. Sarah answered each question as honestly as she could, refusing to claim certainty she didn't feel, but also standing by the core of her decision. She acknowledged that reasonable people could disagree about whether she had made the right choice, and that ambiguity was something military officers had to learn to live with. One question in particular stuck with Sarah long after the conference ended. A student asked if she believed that military officers had a moral obligation to disobey orders they believed were wrong, even at cost to their careers. Sarah thought carefully before answering, finally saying that she believed officers had an obligation to question orders they believed were morally wrong, to make their concerns known through proper channels, and to exhaust every possible avenue for changing those orders. But ultimately, she said, if all those efforts failed, each officer had to make their own decision about whether their conscience would allow them to follow orders they believed would cause harm. There was no universal answer, only individual choices and individual accountability for those choices. The years continued to pass, and Sarah progressed through her career, never reaching the heights she might have achieved without the letter of reprimand, but building a solid record of competent service and effective teaching. She trained hundreds of pilots, many of whom went on to distinguish themselves in combat operations. Several of her former students reached out years later to thank her for the lessons she had taught them, crediting her influence with helping them develop into effective military aviators. These messages meant more to Sarah than any medal or promotion could have, confirming that her service had made a lasting positive impact. When Sarah finally retired from the military after 22 years of service, the ceremony was small and personal, attended by family, close friends, and a handful of colleagues who had served with her over the years. The presiding officer gave a speech that acknowledged her long service and the complex legacy of her career. He mentioned the convoy incident directly, something that hadn't been done at official events for years, describing it as a defining moment that had raised important questions for the entire military about leadership, judgment, and values. He noted that while reasonable people still disagreed about whether her decision had been correct, no one questioned that she had acted from genuine belief that she was serving the greater good. As Sarah stood there in her dress uniform for the last time, She reflected on everything that had led to this moment. A career that had spanned 2 decades, hundreds of combat missions, thousands of hours in the air, countless students trained, and one controversial decision that had changed everything. She thought about the convoy, those 47 vehicles that command had declared untouchable, and the 17 minutes of combat that had ended her chances at senior command while saving hundreds of lives. She thought about all the people who had been affected by her choice, the soldiers who hadn't been killed by the convoy's weapons, the civilians who hadn't been murdered in the planned attacks, the militia members who had died in the explosions she caused. Looking back, Sarah knew she would make the same choice again if faced with the same situation. The cost to her career had been real and significant, but the alternative of letting that convoy reach its destination and carry out its planned attacks would have been morally unbearable. She had learned that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice were very different things, and that being a good person sometimes meant accepting consequences that seemed unfair. She had learned that courage wasn't just about flying into danger, but about standing by your convictions even when everyone told you to back down. In her final words at the retirement ceremony, Sarah spoke directly to the younger service members in attendance. She told them that they would face impossible choices in their careers, moments when the right answer wasn't clear, and when every option carried risks. She encouraged them to think deeply about their values, to understand what they stood for and what they were willing to sacrifice for it. She warned them that doing the right thing wouldn't always be rewarded, that sometimes courage would cost them opportunities and advancement. But she also told them that they would have to live with their choices long after their military careers ended, and that integrity and conscience mattered more than rank or decorations. Sarah walked out of that ceremony as a civilian for the first time in over 2 decades, no longer bound by military regulations or chain of command. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities and uncertainties. She didn't know exactly what came next, what kind of work she would pursue, or what kind of life she would build. But she knew who she was and what she stood for, lessons learned through fire and controversy and years of service. She was the pilot who had destroyed the untouchable convoy, who had saved lives by breaking rules, who had paid a price for her convictions and never regretted it. The story of those 47 vehicles and one pilot's decision to destroy them despite orders to the contrary would continue to be debated in military circles for years to come. Some would hold it up as an example of courageous leadership, while others would cite it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of insubordination. The truth, as Sarah had learned, was more complicated than either simple narrative. It was a story about the difficulty of making moral choices in complex situations, about the costs of integrity, and about the sometimes uncomfortable reality that the right thing to do wasn't always the authorized thing to do. As Sarah drove away from the base for the last time, she felt at peace with everything that had happened. She had served honorably if imperfectly, had made difficult choices and lived with their consequences, had trained the next generation and tried to pass on whatever wisdom she had gained. The convoy incident would always be part of her story, the defining moment that shaped everything that came after. But it wouldn't be the only part of her story, just one chapter in a life of service that had ultimately been about trying to protect people and make a difference in a complicated world. And that, Sarah realized, was enough thing a soldier could do was make the hard choice that no one else was willing to make. Sometimes protecting people meant breaking rules. Sometimes being a good person meant being an imperfect soldier. And sometimes, just sometimes, the convoy that everyone said was untouchable needed to be destroyed. She would not be court-martialed, would not face prison time, and would not be discharged from the service. After the 6-month period, assuming satisfactory completion of the training, she would be eligible to return to flight status and continue her career, though the reprimand would likely affect her chances for promotion. The night passed slowly, filled with thoughts and memories and uncertainty about the future. Sarah didn't sleep much, her mind too active, processing everything that had happened and wondering what dawn would bring of what command said, regardless of the consequences. It was untouchable, they had told her. She was about to prove them wrong.